Welcome, everyone, and welcome to our first program in 2021. And we're actually broadcasting from Panchasirsha, Five-Peaked Mountain, which is the sacred abode of Manjushri in Australia. So this is a very auspicious location. So we're gonna continue where we left off before New Year, before our break, and we're going to continue studies of Abhidharma. Now, Abhidharma is essentially the teaching that enables us to get a handle on our reality. It's the Buddhist teaching that it doesn't really give us the answer in our hand, because the answer is something that lies beyond, you could say, ordinary conceptual construction. But one thing that we can map, that is the functioning within our ordinary reality. Now, there's a big difference between Buddhist science and the conventional, you could say, natural sciences, which are really just about understanding the objective world. And of course, a lot of modern science is aware of the fact that what we do perceive as the objective world could possibly have a lot to do with what we individually project and label as our objective world. So in that sense, there is already within modern physics the notion that there possibly is not what we could call a causal closure. This, of course, is somewhat controversial, but certainly within Buddhism, we very much are aware of the role that the subjective has in terms of our apparently objective and phenomenal world. And that's where any science, really, from the Buddhist point of view, and any understanding of this so-called reality that we have necessarily is contingent on the one that perceives, the mind. And so when we're in the Buddhist teaching, when we're looking at the mind, we're not doing this just because we're trying to, for example, find peace within this mind, but then we're left with the sort of the notion that the mind is essentially our brain, and essentially what we're doing with the practice of, let's say, mindfulness is really just manipulating our neurons so they calm down and there's sort of a sense of peace and so forth. The Buddhist understanding of Abhidharma, the Buddhist understanding of enlightenment, is actually contingent on us properly understanding the entire realm of reality. And that's where we can't separate a subjective dimension here and an objective dimension there. We're actually talking about the entire array of everything, and it's all tied up with the subjective. Now, that in itself, of course, makes for interesting philosophy. But the Buddha's point was not really just making interesting philosophy, just like we might do interesting math, or we might do interesting sort of trivial research that could bring up some interesting data. You know, we could do research on when did the dodo bird, for example, die out? Was it 300 years ago? Was it 400 years ago? You probably could get a whole research grant to investigate when did the dodo bird die out. But in the context of the Buddhist teaching, we're not really about philosophy for philosophy's sake. The Buddha's point really was that as long as we aren't really understanding reality, we're suffering. So us misunderstanding reality and not really how do you say, properly relating to ourselves and the phenomenal world actually leads to a lot of suffering. And the Buddha's diagnosis, and this is where the Buddha is not so much a guru or a prophet or somebody special. The Buddha is much more like a physician, like a doctor. Because what the Buddha discovered was that our suffering, our discomfort, our basic, you could say, existential angst, the whole drama around me, my ego, and so forth, has very little to do with somebody outside, some external agent that might be sort of maybe playing a trick on us and seeing how well we do. It has very little to do with just a random universe where we just happen to be floating around. The fact that we have consciousness is just an incredible sort of interesting mishap that's taking place. And rather, the Buddha's diagnosis of the whole situation of our suffering is there's a delusional condition that takes place within our mind. There's something that takes place within ourselves, and our suffering and our discomfort it has nothing to do with something outside, and it's also not something that's random, but it has something to do with us not really looking at and understanding our reality. So in that sense, we're innocent. We might think, and that's very often sort of the case of the sort of modern way of seeing humans, especially when we sort of ponder the difficult situation of the world nowadays. We might think humans are basically evil. You might think, well, basically all humans are selfish. And there's this whole notion of the selfish gene. And there's the whole notion that, you know, basically everybody's selfish. And sort of a lot of us grew up actually with that notion. But the Buddha's diagnosis was really, yeah, it's true that with selfishness there is suffering. But the thing is, the whole notion around the self, that's actually where the confusion originates. Our consciousness is not naturally selfish. Our original sanity is not tied up with the insecurity and all the, you could say, reactive patterns that come with our ordinary self-centering. And that's where we can actually, in our ordinary life, we can see we're much better off when we're selfless. Everybody's much happier when they're giving. Everybody's much more miserable when they're sort of caught up in a sort of narcissistic syndrome or a circle of self-serving and insecurity and trying to secure myself versus the other. And this is not particularly rocket science. We can basically see it in our world. We can see whenever there is this notion that it's me against the others. People who keep that sort of, you know, that sort of attitude tend to divide. It's me against the others. And with that, you have a corresponding pained existence that really basically is defined by a struggle. Whereas persons who naturally see themselves in the context of their involvement with others and much less of a self-centered attitude, very often have a much greater degree of lightness and happiness and a much greater degree of awareness of others. So we can say there's something very appealing with people who are naturally selfless, that's naturally sort of more inclined to see how are the others. And there's something sometimes even repugnant when we have this notion of us against them. Of course, this is something that we very often identify in terms of politics and, you know, looking at politicians and sort of despising politicians, but we can also see it on a much smaller scale in terms of our ordinary existence. And that's where the Buddha's notion of no self and the trouble with self really is something that's not particularly philosophical. It's something that we can identify within our own experience. It's not something at all mystical. And that's where the Buddha's diagnosis, as far as our reality goes, is that as long as we're tied up in the whole drama around me, we don't actually experience reality. We're just, to a large extent, experiencing reality as per myself. And that's very often a very small place. Whereas the moment that we're more sort of, you could say, engaged in the view of others and less prone to self-centering, more open to the views of others and so forth, much less self-centering, much more selflessness, we actually have a much better grasp of what's going on. Now, this again is also something that we can see in our ordinary life, because we very often come across people who actually are aware, who are actually seeing what's going on in situations. And we very often have people who are sort of caught up in their own sort of defense mechanisms that have very little idea what's going on around them. So there's what we could call a greater epistemic capacity. There's a greater capability of understanding what's what when there's less neurosis that's tied up in self-centering. Of course, all of this we have within Buddhism that's explained in terms of, you could say, the particular Buddhist vocabulary. I'm trying to put this across in terms of just keeping it in a sort of very ordinary vernacular. But it is something that we are looking at basically with the study of Abhidharma. Because what essentially the Buddha is saying is that actually the self doesn't exist. It's only when we get caught up in delusional condition of insecurity, a basic twist within our consciousness, that we begin to operate from this small place of insecurity, me versus the other. And when the mind actually is open and more at ease, then there is much more joy and essentially being present within reality. Now, the Buddha's prescription for this is not that we should go into some particular samadhi, or we should go into some particular realm, spiritual realm. Even though the Buddha does promote meditation, even though the Buddha, you could say his path is spiritual, the Buddha's path is spiritual, yes, because it takes into account the subjective. See, the objectivist science doesn't take so much into account the role that the observer plays. And so when we come across Buddhism, we operate with a science, but it's a science and an empiricism that's based on what we experience with our own mind. And that's where you say the empiricism of Buddhism, as much as it's scientific, it stands apart from the empiricism of the natural sciences that essentially just observe what is objective. And so within the Buddhist tradition and within the Buddhist science, we're much more talking about mind. And that's where Buddhism sounds very spiritual, and it is and ends up being classified as religion. But actually what the whole entire notion of what the Buddha intended was really just for us to see reality clearly. So the Buddha didn't invent reality. The Buddha didn't really have a role in reality. The Buddha didn't even, you could say, invent Buddhism, and didn't invent the notion of enlightenment. All the Buddha did was discover something. And what the Buddha discovered, he shared with others, but it has nothing to do with actually the Buddha himself. The Buddha just discovered reality without the filtering of the ordinary delusion. So in the Buddha's methodology, yes, there's a lot of working with the mind, because that's where the confusion takes place. But it's not as if the Buddha can give us the mantra and say, hey, this is reality. You know, go into this samadhi and there you are in reality. The Buddha's project was actually just to dismantle, take away the veils. So there's actually nowhere that the Buddha is giving us what we could call some sort of metaphysical position. The only thing, it's a bit like if when we're with friends, and let's say our friends is going to a party or meet some new people, and then our friend who might be suffering from incredible social angst and sort of just having a sort of people phobia moment, say, how should I behave? And then we'll say, oh, just be yourself. But the person still thinks, oh, I have to behave in a particular way. And we'll say, no, just be yourself. You don't have to behave in a particular way, because you're good enough. And in a way, that's all the Buddha was saying. Is that, you know, we might say, what is the truth? Oh, Mr. Natural, you know, oh Buddha, what is the truth? And the Buddha said, well, the truth is already there. If you just stop fabricating things, then the truth is there. So this is where you can say there's nowhere actually in the Buddhist teaching that the Buddha is giving the answer, The Buddha is just basically telling us how we could dismantle all that prevents us from seeing reality. And there's actually nowhere where the Buddha is saying, this is it. So that's a really important point. Now, what we're doing with Abhidharma then is having a look at how actually the mind gets itself into this tizzy, and how the mind operates in terms of our relationship to ourself with the phenomenal world, and where this notion of what Steven Goodman, the book that we're studying, the Buddhist Psychology of Awakening, what he talks about is fixity. We've covered that last time, and we talk about what we call skandhas, dhatus, ayatanas, as essentially the way that we solidify reality. And that's where Stephen would say, following the Buddha's sort of inspiration, really, and of course this is all the Buddha's teachings anyway, but the point is that the solution doesn't lie in retreating into something, but it lies in looking at things. So all we're doing with the Abhidharma is really just looking at phenomena, and it's with looking at phenomena that you could say we discover what appears as something that's big and difficult to actually be nothing but a paper tiger. So, for example, when we talk about a self, the Abhidharma approach is actually to say, well, actually, is there a self? It's not like, let's get away from this self and be selfless. You know, that's a bit like saying, you know, well, there might be a thief downstairs, but I'm choosing to say there's no thief downstairs and let's forget all about it. You know, or, you know, there might be a difficulty here, but, you know, we're going to forget all about it. No, actually, if there is no difficulty, there's no harm in looking, right? If there is no thief downstairs, well, we can go downstairs and have a look. And if there's no thief, well, hey, then we can be sure about that. So that's essentially what we're doing with Abhidharma. We're going in and we're looking at the self, and we're seeing actually that all this sort of way that we are relating to the phenomenal world that we can't avoid, it's very real, actually doesn't really exist in terms of having something that is fixed. So that's where this is very helpful when we practice meditation. Because again, what we're doing with the practice of meditation is not, with the practice of meditation, we're not going into some special realm. With the practice of meditation, we're actually connecting with reality. We're much better off being in reality. If we practice meditation in the sense that the world is an evil place and I'm going to practice meditation to sort of retract into a little sort of fetus position, some sort of cosmic, comfort zone where I can recharge, and then I can meet the world, which is basically an evil place, then we're essentially constructing ourselves as very fragile and very alienated in terms of ourselves relating to the world. We're basically believing our projections that the world is an evil place. We're constructing ourselves as fragile. And that kind of approach to meditation is never going to do us any good, except just make us more and more, you know, this is what you sometimes have people who are people who are on the spiritual path become incredibly delicate, you know. The idea of going into retreat for some people is like, I'm going into a place that's very special. And then when they come out of retreat, they're completely freaked out because everything is large and vivid and colorful and noisy and whatnot, you know. But that's actually not why in Buddhism we go into retreat. In Buddhism we go into retreat, and in Buddhism we meditate to connect with reality and to actually dismantle this paranoia around self-centering, dismantle the whole narrative around myself and my delicate self, and to dismantle the whole sort of alienation with regards to the phenomenal world. So in that sense, what we're doing, and this is very much, you can say, the inspiration that we're carrying with us all along in the Buddhist teaching, is really just opening ourselves up to reality. Now, this is, as usual, one of my introductions, and you might think, when is the guy going to start the actual text? Well, actually, I'm guilty of, I'm not even sure I'm going to get to the actual text today, because before we even get to the actual text, I want to go through a text by somebody called Tuku Ujin Rinpoche that in my opinion, actually really nails it in terms of what we're trying to explain here. So I'm going to be reading a little bit from Tugurjen Rinpoche's writings. Now, my particular Buddhist tradition, if you like, is something called the Great Perfection, or Dzogchen. And this is associated with the Nyingma tradition. And I would say the notion of Dzogchen is really basic to the entire Buddhist tradition altogether. So it's not as if Dzogchen is different from any other Buddhism. But Dzogchen comes with very much with the spirit that the innate goodness, the innate sanity that we possess is the most basic thing that we have. We could very well think of this sanity as something that's very hidden within our neurosis, and the biggest thing that we have to actually deal with in our lives is our neurosis and our obscurations and our neurotic patterns, etc., etc. And it's true, these shouldn't be underestimated. But at the same time, the actual ground of our reality is never corrupted. And so this uncorrupted purity is basic to all life. It's basic to all of reality. And like I said before, this is really what the Buddha was teaching. This is really the vision of the Buddha, which is that we want to look at reality. It's not that there's anything wrong with reality. What's happening is that we, out of our insecurity, we're projecting onto our reality. So the purity of our reality and the purity of ourselves is intrinsic to what we are. And this, of course, is the goal of all Buddhist teachings. But in the Dzogchen tradition, there's very much, you could say, this vision of this purity as always being there. And that, of course, is true. However confused we might be, the nature of reality doesn't change. You know, however neurotic I am, doesn't really necessarily change much in the world. It changes the world for me, but it doesn't really affect the world at large, you know, except, of course, my neurosis might have an impact on my dear fellow, you know, fellow friends and citizens. But the reality itself is uncorrupted, and that's very much the vision of the Great Perfection, and it's also, of course, then the vision of Buddhism in general. But here Tugurjen is talking about this Great Perfection teaching, and of course, everything that we do within Siddhartha's intent, and students of Tsongsa Khyentse Rinpoche and Jigme Khyentse Rinpoche and Sakya Trinzen and so on, all these great masters, is very much inspired by this vision of the Great Perfection. So I just thought to sort of link everything up or bring everything together. I just wanted to read something from Tugurjen about Dzogchen, about the Great Perfection. So Tugurjen says, the Great Perfection is totally beyond any kind of pigeonholing anything in any way whatsoever. It is to be utterly open, beyond categories, limitations, and the confines of assumptions and beliefs. All other ways of describing things are confined by categories and limitations. And that, of course, is very often what we have in philosophy and spirituality and religions, where we're trying to sort of label things and set things up in a particular way. Of course, within Buddhism, yes, there's a lot of categories in terms of the path, and there's, of course, the Asian worldview or the Buddhist worldview on the relative level, but the actual nature of reality of itself is uncontaminated by any kind of categories and projections. So that's where the entire Buddhist teaching is more about removing all these limitations, conceptual limitations. So Tugurjen continues, the ultimate destination to arrive at in Dzogchen is the view of the kayas and wisdoms. Now, kayas and wisdoms, again, has nothing to do with something that's Buddhist or constructed. It's really just saying that the ultimate goal of Buddhism is essentially to discover the wisdom within. And here we, of course, we're using Buddhist the words. So you could say we could plant some flowers or grain or whatever, and something's going to come up. And we could call it grain, we could call it corn, we can call it barley, we can call it flowers, lilies, or whatever. But it exists independent of our labels. So the nature of enlightenment also lies beyond you could say, the labels themselves. But kayas and wisdoms is just ways of describing the qualities of enlightenment. So essentially, the objective of all the various Buddhist teachings is essentially to arrive at this place of enlightenment that possesses these qualities. So then Tugurja says, listen to this quote. Although everything is empty, the special quality of the Buddha Dharma is to not be empty of the kayas and wisdoms. And that is where emptiness in the Buddhist sense really means our dismantling of our conceptual constructs. Because what we very often do is we solidify. And that's where we go wrong. That's essentially the difference between Buddhas and sentient beings is we solidify. And that's where the Buddha comes in and says, look, you can't solidify things. Phenomena have nothing about them that can be grasped. That's where we talk about emptiness. Of course, emptiness, if we hear it within a sort of within the context of modernity, it sounds like something very negative and basically a void, but that's not the point. The point is actually that as soon as we begin to solidify things, we actually begin to diminish things and put them into categories, and we essentially diminish reality. But what the Buddha said with emptiness is actually trying to get us out of that place where we solidify self and we solidify the phenomenal world. So it's essentially the teachings on emptiness is to open up to something far greater. But it's within that then the mind is set free. And that's where the qualities of enlightenment become manifest. So even though the Buddha says there's nothing you can grasp, he also says, but within that non-grasping, you could say the whole experience of life blossoms. That's why if you look at somebody like the Dalai Lama, it's not as if the Dalai Lama is some sort of spiritual flatliner that's just, it's all empty, you know, it's all empty. I'm incredibly wise, and I've been in the mountains and I've meditated and I've come back and I can tell you it's all empty. It'll be totally depressing and rather bad news. So the thing is, if you look at a sage, if you look at a wise person, the wise person is free. The rest of us, we're a little bit sort of struggling a little bit. We're not that we don't have the same material as the sage, but there's just a little bit of cognitive dysfunction that's taking place, this insecurity of me and my drama. And that's where meeting the sage is wonderful. The sage is not different from us, but the sage is free. That's, of course, also where we have to be somewhat discerning. You're not going to go up to the first, the best, Mr. Natural and say, hey, I'm going to follow you. You know, I don't know if anybody remembers, what's his name, Robert Crumb's Mr. Natural, sort of 1960s sort of Haight-Ashbury art. But anyway, there you had this rather uncompassionate guru called Mr. Natural. And we do in the spiritual world come across a lot of, you could say, fishy, unqualified, inauthentic teachers. And that's where, of course, we have to be really discerning. But if we have the fortune to come across somebody who is a genuine sage, what really is the hallmark of this sage are the qualities of blossoming, the qualities of being loving, of being vivid, of being alive. And we essentially say enlightenment comes with three qualities, which is what we call wisdom, compassion, and strength. And this is then where we can't just rely on, you could say, the books and the theory. This is where it's very inspiring to actually have persons that embody this. So that's where also, as far as you could say Buddhism as a science goes, it moves beyond sort of the notion of academic science, which you could learn from just books and manuals and so on, and into a realm of lived experience. And that is why when you come to a Buddhist temple, for example here, you're going to find pictures of actual living persons. And the inspiration and the thrust of the entire Buddhist project is that this is a living tradition. This is not just sort of a hand-me-down secret from Tibet. This is actually a living tradition with living people who we have something in common with. So that's where we would say enlightenment is not just saying, oh yeah, there's nothing that can be grasped. It also comes with this notion of the qualities of the manifest aspect of enlightenment. And so here Togurjen, he is talking about a little bit the difference between Dzogchen, or the Great Perfection, which very much highlights this living quality of this awake purity. And sometimes within the Buddhist teaching, there's a lot of emphasis on emptiness. Simply stress, like for example, if you come across the Heart Sutra, it'll make a big point on saying there's no this, there's no that, and to chant all these kind of things that actually you could say don't have any ultimate existence. And so Togurjen continuously says, all of the system expounds that all things are empty. But truly, the intention of the Buddha is to use the word emptiness rather than empty. This is a very important point. Actually, I was just corresponding with a friend of mine who's translating the word emptiness into German. And that's where some of the translators, they would like to just make a point that what we're talking about here is something is empty. I think in German it's leer. But then again, when we talk about emptiness, it's not just that things are empty, but it's emptiness. It means that it's not as if it is empty, it's like empty, empty like. So it's more pointing to the fact that you can't grasp it. But just because you can't grasp it doesn't mean that there's nothing there. So again, the nature of mind, the nature of our reality is not some sort of blank void. It's just that just like a rainbow, it's vivid, it's brilliant, but it cannot be grasped. So Togurjen says, the intention of the Buddha is to use the word emptiness rather than empty. This is a very important point. For instance, he says, in the Prajnaparamita scriptures, you find the statements, outer things are emptiness, inner things are emptiness, emptiness is emptiness, the vast is emptiness, the ultimate is emptiness, the conditioned is emptiness, the unconditioned is emptiness. Emptiness here, he says, should be understood as empty cognizance. Please understand that. The suffix ness implies the cognizant quality. We need to understand this word in its correct connotation. So if we're looking in our own mind, we cannot find anything about our own mind that is tangible. But yet the mind is constantly, you could say, giving rise to thinking, emotions, notions of one sort or another. But that's where we can also see, on the basis of what arises in the mind, there's a place where the mind can go into sort of its self-consciousness, and it's me in relation to what's happening. And then also mind can go into this place where it's at ease. Tongpa makes an interesting sort of analogy for where our experience, where we are one, you could say non-duality, and where it goes into self. He says it's a bit like if you're dancing. So if you're dancing, if you go down to some of the drum circles that we have around here, I just came across a drum circle in Bronze yesterday, and then you could be dancing there, and you don't have any sense of just other than just being lifted by the joy of being at one with the dance. But then all of a sudden you might all of a sudden go, "Oh, I'm really dancing nicely." Or somebody says, "Yeah, remember this?" Sometimes I used to dance a lot, and sometimes people would come up to you and sort of say, "Wow, you're really dancing well." And then all of a sudden you're conscious of your dancing, and at that point there's yourself, there's the dance, and there's the space around you. And that's what all of a sudden, from having this, you could say, non-dual sense of unity with everything, all of a sudden you retreat into this. And of course you keep dancing, but all of a sudden you're thinking, my dance, yeah, I am pretty good, this is pretty groovy. And all of a sudden it just becomes clunky. And all of a sudden, yourself, the other, and everything just becomes clunky. And of course, the nothing has changed except it's just in your own head. And and that's where you could say the Buddha, in a way, just wants to come along and just sort of say, make it all undone again, back to non-duality. And that's where there's nothing there to be grasped except just let go. And that's where we talk about emptiness. But the point here, and what Togurjen is saying, is not a blank nothingness. Because we could hear all this emptiness talk and just think, oh, it means there's nothing. Not really like that. Actually, when you're at ease with your reality, you're really enjoying it. But you're not thinking me and the reality. It's like when you're truly sort of engaged in a trusting relationship with somebody, there's an ease. Whereas when you begin to sort of check the other, and then somebody might say, "Oh, just relax," then you're still checking the other, and then you're also thinking, "I should relax." You know, it's the whole thing becomes a sort of a slightly clunky process. So the Buddha's right. The Buddha wants to say there's nothing there, that there's nothing that can be grasped, and yet at the same time we shouldn't misunderstand that and think that's all there's to it, just the word relax or the word emptiness. And that's where we want to understand that that word emptiness is really just like, it's just like talking about it, but it's not the actual thing. So Tugurjan says the suffix ness implies a cognizant quality. So when we say emptiness, it's like empty like. It's not really that there's nothing there. So we need to understand, he says, this word and its correct connotation. He says, otherwise it sounds too nihilistic to simply say that outer things are empty. If we understand emptiness as empty or void, rather than empty cognizance, we're leaning too much towards nihilism, the idea that everything is a big blank void. This is a serious sidetrack. The Buddha initially taught that all things are empty. Now, this is true. We talk about the three turnings of the wheel, where we would say the Buddha taught the Four Noble Truths, which essentially identifies the key role of the mind. So when we understand where does suffering come from, we understand it doesn't come about just randomly. It's not something that's given by somebody else, but it has to do with our mind. And also the Buddha, in teaching the Four Noble Truths, he also identified how this is curable. Our condition of delusion is not an ultimate. It's a curable condition. We have a dysfunction, we have an illness taking place here, but it can be cured. But it's not going to cure itself. It's not going to help that you sign up at the local Buddhist church, or you become a sort of a follower, or that you just sort of like Buddhism, or you like the theory, or you like the great photographs and the big coffee table books from Tibet and what have you. But actually one needs to do something. And that's, of course, where it's rather annoying that there actually is a path. But that's the fourth noble truth. Just like your doctor can say, "Oh, yeah, there's no problem. This is curable," but it doesn't help if we don't actually take the medicine or follow the course of remedy. So that's the first turning of the wheel. But the second turning of the wheel is then where the Buddha identified there's actually nothing about reality that can be grasped. And that's where we have the Prajnaparamita teachings that speak about emptiness. But ultimately, this nature defies any notion of empty or apparent or whatever. And we would sometimes say the nature of reality is beyond any conceptual constructs, but it has this quality of enlightenment. And that's where we talk about Buddha nature. And that's what we call the third turning of the wheel. So we have the first turning of the wheel, which talks about the key role of the mind, the Four Noble Truths. Then we talk about emptiness. We talk about how reality cannot be grasped. And then we talk about the outcome of that understanding, how that exists as a natural potential, that wisdom that knows this is basic to us. And this is the third turning of the wheel, which is then the understanding, the unconditional, primordially pure nature that abides within ourselves. And this, of course, is where Vajrayana takes its whole notion of our Buddha nature as deity. So when you come across Vajrayana, there's a lot of notion of deity, because there's a notion that our self and our reality innately exists free from our projections. And that's where you could say the whole of our reality is sacred. And that's where the Vajrayana has its notion of mandala, deity, and so on. But to understand that, to appreciate that, then it has to go through a dismantling of our projections. And that's where emptiness is so important. So Tugurjan says, the Buddha initially taught that all things are empty. This was unavoidable. Indeed, it was justifiable, because we need to dismantle our fixation on the permanence of what we experience. A normal person clings to the content of his or her experience as solid, as being that, not just mere experience, but as something which has solidity, which is real. which is concrete and permanent. This we do, you know. I think Tim, yep, Tim, solid Tim, you know. In fact, for Tim is, as it exists for me, it's just an idea. And Tim is constantly changing, you know. So there's you could say a whole array of reality. Our whole, you could say, nature reality is constantly in flux, which of course also the Greek philosophers or Heraclitus made a point about. But the thing is, we project onto that solidity, you know. I think, oh yeah, that's the same old Tim like last time. But no, actually, Tim has changed, you know. And we very often struggle with that, you know. We might be in a relationship and all of a sudden after a year or two, we go, you've changed, you know. Well, duh, you know, and things do change. It's like constantly everything. And we try. This is actually a sad thing. We try to solidify and hold on to things. But unfortunately, we can't do this. So we might think the Buddha, if only the Buddha could just give us the reassurance that you can go to heaven and up there, nothing's going to change. It's all going to be fine. But, you know, everything that you always wanted, you're going to get somewhere else. But of course, no, it's not going to happen. That one who wants everything according to how we want it, that's the one that gets us in trouble. It's not that things aren't behaving the way that they should, because things just behave the way they do. It's us basically struggling, going up against the stream. And that's where the Buddha has to say, sorry, things are impermanent. Sorry, things don't have the reality that we attribute to it. And that's where this is not easy because it goes against our habitual patterns. This is where we can't go up to the Buddhist priest and ask, can we please wave a magic wand and everything will be okay? Make my delusion go away, or at least make everything, you know, fine again. Not going to work. It's like we have a delusion and it needs to be dealt with. And that's where there has to be some change in our experience. Now, this change in our experience is not that difficult because we can actually, the change comes about through connecting with reality. And that's the good news. It's not like we need to go into some alternative reality. We just need to connect with the reality that we already are in. So this is where we need to understand that what we think of as solid, in fact, is just our experience of something that is solid. And that's where we need to begin to let go of our notion of things as concrete and permanent. Too good, it says, if we look honestly and closely at what happens, experience is simply experience, and it is not made out of anything whatsoever. It has no form, no color, no sound, no taste, no texture. It is simply experience, an empty cognizance. So there's nothing that we can grasp on to phenomena that possesses some inherent solid form, sound, color, all these things that we experience in terms of our perceptions. Yes, they're real in the sense that they're perceived, but there's nothing about them that is solid and unchanging. And that's where we have this experience of phenomena as being vividly present within our experience, and yet there's nothing graspable to them. That's what Tugujins talks about this as empty cognizance, empty experience. So we haven't even gotten onto the text yet, and I haven't even gone through this little text that I was going to run through here before we begin the text. So we might be going through this next time also, but I think this is really valuable in terms of actually, you could say, clarifying the context of the Abhidharma study. Tugujin goes on to say, the vivid display in manifold colors you see with open eyes is not mind, but illuminated matter. Similarly, when you close your eyes and see something dark, it's not mind, but dark matter. So it's not as if that we have something solid here that is out there as, you could say, solidly there being projected by our mind. It's just the mind has the quality of manifesting infinitely. And within these infinite projections, there's nothing that we can actually grasp. And that's where we could say whatever perceptions we have, they're simply just perceptions that have this luminous quality of manifesting. This is a really great thing with our world. I mean, we can sometimes, when we're happy, then actually we go, wow, the world is amazing. You know, we look up and there's trees, there's the sky, there's mountains, rocks, fellow humans, fellow creatures. We actually, I think we would prefer that to nothing whatsoever. You know, I mean, some people might like to be up in heaven and sort of some sort of notion where you're being constantly gratified, but that would actually be incredibly stagnant. Actually, Somerset Rinpoche, he once defined hell as the place where our ideas are never challenged and where we get everything we want. That could actually be hell. Curiously enough, because it's dead. It's so dead. We are actually alive through the tension between us and what is manifesting constantly. So there's a purity in reality that you could say is a luminous quality of reality. It's not just that there's reality and we're kind of like, no, it has a luminous quality of truth to it. And that's where reality is not just some sort of the phenomenal world, but it's lit up by this quality. Sometimes we talk about it in terms of luminosity. Sometimes we talk about it in terms of bliss. Sometimes we just talk about it in terms of color or whatever. But the bottom line is that reality exists in terms of this perceived realm that carries this quality of truth to it. So whether we're seeing things or not seeing things, whether we are seeing things out there in terms of what's taking up our space in terms of perception, or if we're not seeing anything, we're closing our eyes and we're actually still seeing, but we're just seeing nothing. In both cases, Goodman says, matter is merely a present. The objective experience is merely a present, an experience of something. It is mind that experiences the external elements and everything else. So in that sense, whether we are seeing something or we can close our eyes and say we're not seeing something, there's still somebody that's undergoing this experience. So we can't deny that if I close my eyes, it's only really me who has my eyes closed and I'm experiencing that particular perception. Or if I'm looking out, it's only me who sees this. At the end of the day, there's not really an objective reality independent from our mind. Of course, this could lead to this potentially leads to some interesting philosophical discussions, including what we call solipsism. But for the time being, let's just stick to the observable empirical fact that everything we do experience through our mind. So Gorgias goes on to say, an appearance can only exist if there is a mind that beholds it. The beholding of that appearance is nothing other than experience. That is what actually takes place. Without a perceiver, how could an appearance be an appearance? It wouldn't exist anywhere. Perceptions are experienced by mind. They're not experienced by water or earth. So it takes an animate consciousness to actually have experience. This is not really sort of hierarchical. It's not like I'm saying I'm better than the table, but it's just to say that right now, because of my personal experience of consciousness, then I undergo the whole experience of being living and having particular perceptions. So this experience of this mind is key. Now, Tugurjan says, without a perceiver, how could an appearance be an appearance? It wouldn't exist anywhere. Perceptions are experienced by mind. They're not experienced by water or earth. All the elements are vividly distinguished as long as the mind fixates on them. So our perception of the world just exists in terms of how we choose to perceive them. We could say a little bit sort of, correct me if I'm wrong, but I gather within quantum physics, they talk about the world as you could say a field of possibilities. And what we actually do with our perception is we we have what's called a quantum breakdown, where we actually, each individual moment of perception is really just what we choose to see. It's really that there's an infinite field of possibilities, but we choose a particular experience. And that's where it's our particular making of the phenomenal world that identifies it as it is. So this is where there's a little bit of a sort of overlap between quantum physics and Buddhism in this regard. And all we're really talking about is just, again, the observer's role in terms of all our perceptions. So, and this is the important point, yet they are nothing but a mere presence, an appearance. It is mind that apprehends this mere presence. When the mind doesn't apprehend, hold, or fixate on what is experienced, in other words, when the real authentic samadhi of suchness dawns within your stream of being, reality loses its solid, unobstructed quality. Now here, when we talk about the samadhi of suchness, the authentic samadhi of suchness, we're actually talking about the yoga, the sort of the quintessential yoga that is basic to what we call the great perfection, but which is also basic to any practice of vipassana in Buddhism, which is essentially us beginning to connect with reality free from our projections. What we mean with suchness is beginning to connect with reality as it is, rather than how we project onto it. So as long as we're not actually freeing the mind from its ordinary narratives and ordinary projections, and that of course is what we're training within the practices of vipassana, shamatha vipassana, whatever practice we do. As long as we don't do that, we're caught up in our projections. And what we are doing on the path is eliminating these projections. What we're doing with the study of Abhidharma is that we're beginning to identify how these perceptions are in fact projections. So this is not in fact learning about reality, it's more learning about the delusion and how we actually could, you could say, stay free of delusion. Just like the doctor, or if we're following some course of remedy, it's not really about constructing our health, but it's really just about eliminating what's preventing our health to manifest. So when we're following a cure, it's essentially based on the you could say the underlying recognition that health is innately there, but there's conditions that come in and veil our health. And so that's where we don't actually, the doctor doesn't construct our health, but the medicine doesn't construct our health. But what the medicine can do is it can eliminate what weakens our health. And that's what also what we're doing with the practice of the path and the samadhi of suchness. So Goodman goes on to say, this is why accomplished yogis cannot be burned, drowned, or harmed by wind. You know, we talk about, there's generally three things that sort of tend to eliminate things. In Tantrism, we talk about fire, wind, and water. We say things are burnt. What's left after you burn them, you can be blown away by the wind, and then you finally wash away with water. But in that sense, the yogi is not in any way caught by attachment to ordinary conditions. And that's where the yogi that is settled into suchness, we would say, has no fear with regards to the phenomenal world, with regards to external circumstances. So Goodman says, in their experience, all appearances are a mere presence, since fixation has it disintegrated from within. Mind is that which experiences, that within which experience unfolds. What else is there to experience? Mind means individual experience. All experience is individual, personal. So we'll just leave it at that. And of course, I'd like to say here that what we're saying is not necessarily solipsism in the sense that, oh yeah, there's nothing in this world except me. Because that would mean the moment that I leave this room, all of you would disappear, right? As far as if I go down to the toilet, you would all go away, if everything really was just my projection. But that's not the case. The only thing is as far as I'm concerned, everything that I experience, including you guys, that is taking place through my mind, in the way that I project, solidify, identify, and so on. That is then taking place in terms of my mind. And that is where we identify, you could say, our responsibility or our connectedness with our individual mind and how it projects. Okay, how's that for a little light discussion, sort of first day? Huh?
It's really good.
Yeah, you're all right. Let's see if there's any. Let's see if there's any questions here. And okay. Okay. Which text are you referring here by Togojian, please? It's a text called As It Is. And this is volume 1, chapter 2, I think, in As It Is, from Togojian. And then somebody says, spiritual flatliner, is that a Buddhist term? Is that a technical Buddhist term? No, it's not. But we have the notion of flatliner when there's basically no more life, you know, when there's no more, you know, when you have these, what they call echocardiographies or whatever. Yeah, when there's no heartbeat, you know, you have the technology that registers the heartbeat, and then all of a sudden it goes flat. So you'd think that, well, for some, if nothing or voidness or emptiness was the ultimate sort of enlightenment, that would mean that essentially enlightenment would be nothing. It would be just voidness. So that's where you might think that if you're too caught up in the notion of emptiness, that enlightenment signifies sort of just nothing, and that somebody who is enlightened, it's actually someone who's enlightened comes alive. Okay, then there's a question here. Since we are challenging our assumptions here, I am wondering why there's an assumption that water or maybe a plant doesn't have a mind. I do believe those things don't have a mind. However, why do we conclude that they don't perceive? Hence, they don't have any kind of cognition. We don't actually. This is actually an interesting question. My God, some people can get really passionate about this, and for very good reason. We don't actually say that at any time that the universe is inanimate. But you can say the whole universe is permeated by this luminous cognizant quality. And it's only us who retreat into this dualistic notion of me and the other. We could say the phenomenal world and plants don't have that. The only reason why you could say when we talk about sentient beings and compassionate for sentient beings is that there we're talking about the deluded individual consciousness that gets itself tied up. And that plants don't have that. So we're not saying that plants are inanimate in any way, or we're not saying that plants are dead, or the phenomenal world for that matter, hills or trees or whatever it might be, are necessarily inanimate. But we're just talking about, when we talk about sentient beings, we are talking about those that are caught up in a consciousness that is caught up in this cycle of duality, and consequently that then suffer from the experience of samsara, that has suffering. So that's why in a way we could look to trees and honor their sanity. We could say trees are actually perfect, the way that they meet light and so forth. And so in that sense, we don't really talk about the phenomenal world in terms of having or not having a mind. We would really, in terms of the phenomenal world, we talk about this in terms of the primordial quality of cognizance and its radiance. And this is also the basis for when we in Tantrism have the Yabyum or the Shiva Shakti image, you know, the male female in union. This is actually the subject and the object and the subjective, you could say, observer and the phenomenal observed. And in this way, the field of reality that includes the 5 elements, earth, water, wind, fire, space, did I get them all? Uh, so the 5 elements are seen as the 5 mothers or the 5 consorts, and the wisdom that perceives this is seen in terms of what we call the 5 Buddhas. And this is very often why you in Tantrism then come across deities that are in the Abhidharma or in the posture of sexual union, Shiva Shakti. And this has nothing to do with sort of trying to sanctify, make your sex life a little bit more sort of interesting and a little bit more sort of holy and all of that. It's not like the tantrikas, they're kind of trying to wangle their way into sort of getting a little bit of sex in terms of their spiritual part, but it's actually it has a significance in terms of understanding our reality, because the image of the sexual union is the one place that we ordinarily experience the greatest bliss. And it's actually in that, we could say that's a metaphor for non-duality, because that's where there's no longer the battle between self and other. And that's again where also we would say the sentient being battles and struggles because there's me and the other, me and my relationship to the phenomenal world. And because there's a self and the phenomenal world is perceived as other, by nature there's suffering. There's I'm getting what I want, I'm not getting what I want, and all of that. That's basically, you could say, the suffering of a sentient being. Whereas in the absence of that, then the phenomenal world is experienced, like I was saying before with the example of the dance. It's bliss. There's not the notion of me struggling with the other. There's no clunkiness taking place. And that's where there's bliss. So that's where the unconditioned freedom from duality is then represented in the image of the sexual union in the Abhidharma. So that's where we think in terms of the phenomenal world, in terms of that as the lover, and as such the interaction with the phenomenal world is not really seen in terms of us against them, me and you and self and other. To experience phenomena as luminous, is this a taste of being free of normal dualistic habitual perception, i.e. that one can have a taste but revert to habit? Well, here I think Tugurjan just actually, I think Tugurjan was just talking about in terms of what we can see and what we can't see. But of course, the notion of phenomena as being luminous is again coming back to what we were just talking about right now, is phenomena free from duality, which then stand out without the ordinary projection. You could say the unimaginative dualistic projection of phenomena. And as such, we say that phenomena are luminous. But I think actually when Tugurjan was talking about this, he just meant that we see things and with open eyes, and when we don't see things with closed eyes. So true to tradition, I'm going over time. Okay. Any questions here from the live studio audience?
Well, so I'm kind of looking at how to reframe some of that in my
brain. Okay. And
so the idea of if you have the perception of cognizance is empty of solidity, in a way that's the reliable perception. You can feel sensory phenomenon is arriving, I'm experiencing it, it doesn't feel solid, that's a reliable experience and empty cognition. So it's really empty of solidity, and then it's like, okay, that's a clear perception.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So the how would you phrase that very briefly?
Well,
so the question,
that I'm just checking in with the reframe, just to say, with perception, if it's empty of solidity, whatever is being seen, there's a felt sense this is empty of solidity. That's a reliable, trustworthy cognizance.
Yes. Yeah. It's interesting when we talk about cognizance, and this is again coming back to Dzogchen, we would include in cognizance any perceived phenomena, and we actually refer to that as compassion. It's an interesting term because we talk about essence, nature, and compassion, or sometimes we talk about nature, character, and compassionate capacity, but we essentially say that all of perception, all of our reality that we experience is in fact display. And when it's no longer, when that display is not held by dualistic clinging, it appears as non-dual luminous phenomena, which we actually refer to then as inseparable from cognizance. We refer to it as the compassion. So that's a particular Dzogchen phrase, actually, which has very little to do actually with the normal notion of compassion as being sort of empathizing with the suffering of others.
Well, I wonder if that has to do with the fact that the heart's fully in union in a non-dual way with what's being experienced. So there's a continual flow of felt as this is the truth.
Yes.
So the heart sort of expression of that wisdom is compassion.
Yep.
The mind experience of it is more just empty clarity.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just another way.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So the rephrasing here is that the sort of the mind's clarity is one aspect, but the sort of the quality of the heart in terms of the lack of struggle between self and other.
There's just a felt recognition. This is part of the whole. It's undivided, compassionately felt as part of it.
Yeah, that undivided relationship to the other. And this is also why we sometimes talk about what we call non-referential compassion, which is essentially this recognition of non-duality. But this we would refer to as a non-referential compassion, because, and in there you don't have compassion in the ordinary dualistic sense where there's me being compassionate to somebody else. It's just naturally present with the other. And there's not, and this is also we would say the compassion of the Buddha, because the Buddha doesn't think, oh, I'm being compassionate to so-and-so. And the Dalai Lama doesn't walk around thinking, gosh, I'm compassionate, you know? So in that sense, it's something that's innate to non-duality. Back to the dance, yes. Then someone says, I accidentally chopped off part of my finger 2 weeks ago. Oh, yikes. Is there a way to look at what feels like such a real pain that you might find useful to discuss? I think at this point, it's when it comes to these kind of experiences we have, they're very real for us, and they're a unique personal experience. And so that's where it's always a little bit difficult to sort of take that into, I mean, sure, there's lots of, if you were to ask me as a meditation instructor how to work with that, that's one thing. But to do it in terms of philosophy, I'm always a little bit wary, because one thing is you've chopped off part of your finger, which must be incredible, painful. And my default position is just to say, wow, that must be so painful. For me, to sort of start saying, well, it's all empty, you know. And recently I heard about somebody who went to see somebody who was diagnosed with cancer. And this guy, and I can't believe it, there are Buddhists out there that say these things. So this is the person who's received the diagnosis with cancer and is fearing their life. And this Buddhist, and like I say, my friend who was telling this story told me the name of this person. I know this person, I've met this person. I can't believe they would say such a thing. The guy says, oh yeah, well, at the end of the day, it's all emptiness. You know, like, you cannot believe that people can actually say these things, you know. And that's why also, if somebody cuts off part of your finger, I'm not going to tell you, well, it's all empty, you know. I'm just going to say my heart goes out to you for actually, you know, I hope you're having a doctor look at it. And of course, in terms of working with the pain, we can discuss that, but that's more in terms of, you could say, meditation and so forth, yeah. So, rather than to whether one can have that taste. Yes, so someone asking, could we have an experience of luminosity and then come back to dualistic solidifications? This happens all the time, all the time. That's the nature of the path. You can say we have samsara, we have nirvana, and then there's us on the journey, which is the path, and that's where we're continually, you can say, familiarizing ourselves with reality, but we continually fall back into habitual constructions. So then somebody says, unfortunately, questions from the studio audience are very garbled and hard to understand for Zoomers. Yeah, I apologize about that. I was trying to rephrase it, but I'm sorry if I failed in doing so. I'll get my stuff together. Then someone says, I also know such people. My answer to them is, it's great that you're such a practitioner. Oh, this is to the person who said to the cancer patient, it's all empty. Yeah, well, for this person, it was deeply hurtful. It's like, people who lost their child, and then somebody goes up and says, well, that's your karma. It's like unbelievable insensitivity, right? And but that is where, unfortunately, sometimes it's just terrible. But you can't really, so it's not as if there's something wrong with the science of karma or the science of the emptiness. It's just incredible insensitivity on some people's part. There are people who say, well, it's karma. Yeah, that's again quite sad and non-empathetic. Yeah. So please don't do that. That's my request. If we're talking about emptiness, as we're doing here, and we're talking about the nature of reality, we have to understand that for the time being, one thing is to understand, begin to have an inkling and begin to sort of be on the track of what reality is and discover a greater dimension of freedom, but also to understand that we still fall into habitual patterns. And us presenting some sort of cerebral, philosophical digest of our superficial, sort of, you could say, embryonic understanding is not going to help anybody. So please, rather than, share all your cerebral wisdom, just better hug people and be nice to them. Bring them flowers and, chocolates and stuff like that. Okay, we're gonna conclude at this point. Just the session, and I'll just dedicate it. But can chant a few verses of dedication. By this merit, may all attain omniscience. May it defeat the enemy wrongdoing. From the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death. From the ocean of samsara, may all beings be free. May bodhicitta, precious and sublime, arise where it has not yet come to be, and where it has arisen, may it never fail, but grow and flourish ever more and more. Okay. We'll just take a 2-minute break, and then I'll say a little bit about meditation, and then we'll practice meditation. So, thank you. 2-minute break. So this is actually the part where I never have any idea about what I'm going to say. It's true. I've been doing this for a long time, and I actually, honestly, I never know what I'm going to say. But I end up saying something, I guess. So, okay, yes, with the practice of, before actually, what we've just discussed is identifying how reality exists free of our ordinary projections. So really what we're doing with Buddhism is essentially deprogramming. We're not even trying to put something in there in place. So when we talk about Buddhist practice, it's actually a little bit limited to say it's Buddhist practice, because actually we're not practicing anything. When we're doing shamatha vipassana, we're actually, it's a bit like if you go to, you go to the Three Sisters up in the Blue Mountains, or you go to the Grand Canyon, and you're with your friend, and your friend just keeps talking about how wonderful this is, Wow, this is fantastic. And at one point you have to say, okay, can we just shut it, please, and just look? And actually, it's not as if you're imposing anything. Then your friend might say, well, Jakob, he's just such a fascist, and you don't want to go hiking with him because he's going to direct the whole experience. Well, actually not. But what you're just trying to do is actually open up for the actual experience of being there. So similarly, also in the case of the Buddha teaching meditation, it wasn't like the Buddha wanted to teach something particular Buddhist. Actually, it's interesting that the Buddha's enlightenment actually came after the Buddha himself had been practicing yoga for 6 years and practicing extreme, you could say, a hardcore yoga, where he would, he was practicing practices where you would sit in ice cold water, you would sit in fire, you would live off just one grain for a very long time, and so on. And it was actually only when the Buddha abandoned any system that the Buddha was set free. So it'd be very sad if all of a sudden Buddhism was understood as a system, which of course it is. And this, of course, is something we can't do anything about, because that's going to happen the moment that we open our mouth, the moment that let's say that, it's like I'm always saying, with opinions, what makes conflicts in this world is opinions. And that's my opinion, right? So I could promote, let's not having opinion. I could even make a political party saying, let's not have any opinions, people. And we could go around telling people, let's not have opinions, and the place will be a beautiful place. And somebody who says, yeah, that's your opinion, Jakob, go, sit on it, And so in that sense, the Buddha, in presenting the path, is up against this paradox of the path as a system. But in fact, everything that the Buddha taught was essentially to deprogram. And so with the practice of meditation, we are actually not really doing anything except just connecting with reality. And that's where the good news in all of this is that the Buddha's diagnosis of reality is that it's good. The Buddha's diagnosis of our mind is that it's good. That's why this, what we call Buddha nature, is something that is the abiding innate quality that we're uncovering, is by nature good. Chögyam Trungpa, he refers to it as basic goodness. And that, of course, is where we can say, if you connect with reality, you look at the Buddha, you look at the masters and so on, hey, something's good, there's something good in that. So that's where you could say the outcome of dismantling all the artifice and all the, you could say, corruption of our mind is really, really valuable. But it has to be not just a sort of a dreamy, vague project. It has to be actually done effectively. And that's where there's need for a guidance. And there is a system that the Buddha prescribed. Just like, you know, we could want to become healthy again, and we could have all the incentives and so on. But it actually really helps if we have a good therapist, if we have a doctor that really knows what exactly is the ailment and knows exactly what to do. That's hugely reassuring. If we're sick and there's somebody who says, I know exactly what you have and we can do something about it. And the moment that you begin to actually follow the treatment, you already begin to feel better. And this happens when you practice meditation. There's no rocket science in this. You sit down and you're beginning to not follow after the thoughts. You know how to do this. There's naturally a quality of peace and clarity that emerges. Just like people actually, they are remarkably sane when they have vacation, or if they have a day off, or if they just relax. They don't necessarily imposing something new. They're just allowing their own goodness to sort of take a breather and actually manifest. So this is what we're doing with the practice of meditation. And so, of course, yes, we do have a system, but that system is not an end in itself. It is a vessel, it's a vehicle to take us somewhere. So the system here in this case is then what we call shamatha and vipassana. Shamatha is the aspect of meditation where we actually have, you could say, a system or a structure. And that's where we sit, basically so we can connect with being properly present. In Indian yoga, you would say all the various aspects of hatha yoga are aimed towards what we call Raj yoga. The hatha yoga is about the exercises, the stretches, and the bandhas, and all the various aspects of doing something. But the objective of that is actually to enable us to practice the highest yoga, which is Raj yoga, which is then settling the mind. And that's where shamatha is the practice of the structure where we sit and where we actually are fully present. Because normally when we move around, we're a little bit sort of, you know, our attention is a bit scattered and we're rather fragmented and a bit distracted and so on. Shamatha is where we're not distracted, we're actually fully here. And that's a very good place to be for us to begin to connect with reality. Because whether we're distracted or not, reality is always there. So the more that we connect with reality, the more we're in sync with it. So that's where shamatha is very helpful. And that's where we have the posture, and also we have the way of focusing the mind. The posture is what we often refer to as the sevenfold posture of Vairocana, which is essentially sitting straight. We don't have to sit on the ground. We can sit on a chair. But this sort of traditional way of explaining it would have, you know, you sit in your lotus or half lotus posture. But nowadays, of course, we don't live in a culture where that's terribly normal. So all Buddhist teachers and teachers of meditation in general would all accommodate that we might need to sit on chairs. You know? So that's completely legit. But in addition to that, then we would then have a straight spine. We would take the shoulders a little bit back, the chin a little bit in. We say we would rest the tongue on the palate. We would lower the gaze. We'd have the hands on the knees or in our lap. And as such, then, the basic posture of meditation is really one of just projecting presence and alertness. So this is where we have this posture. At the same time that we prescribe how to sit, it's also not something we do in a rigid way. It's relaxed. But it is a place where actually, if we, for example, slouch, then the mind also slouches in some way. You know, I mean, if we're great yogis, we're still aware, even if we're slouching or reclining. But sitting up straight feels really good. So that's where this yogic aspect of the posture is quite helpful. So that provides you could say, a framework for physical calm. Now, psychological calm comes about when we're not blindly tagging along with all the thoughts that arise in the mind, because we're constantly distracted in terms of the various perceptions with the five senses. We're constantly distracted by the arising of thoughts, memories, thoughts about what might come, and so forth. So we're very much distracted by the content of our various senses, including the thoughts. What we do with the practice of meditation is actually that even though that we have the perceptions that arise, we actually still can remain present without necessarily being distracted by these thoughts. We can actually see this when we, for example, come across somebody who's lost in thought. And we see somebody who's lost in thought, and if we go over and sort of snap our fingers, they come back. And it's not that they come back to something, but it's more that they're not lost in whatever they were lost in. So they're no longer distracted. They're actually present, and there's a wakeful quality with that. So that's where the practice of meditation is, where we begin to connect with reality. But that reality that we're connecting to is not something. It's just that we're not caught up in distraction. So you very often have meditation instructions that would say, don't fixate on anything, just remain in the natural state. But the thing is, unless we actually have some sort of extraordinary degree of insight, then we tend to very often be driven by our thinking. And that's where it's very helpful to have something that we come back to that's not conceptual. And that's why in all Buddhist meditation, you would start off with simply having an object like the breath, or some external object like a flower or a Buddha statue or something you visualize, that essentially is a place you come back to. So in this case, in general, I would always recommend coming back to the breath. We're going to be doing a practice where we initially focus on the Buddha, but that's more just to sort of set the atmosphere. But once we then dissolve the reference point of the Buddha, then we settle into simply just being present, and there we sustain that presence through awareness of the breath. We can try and see how our awareness goes if we, for example, we can, for example, count the breath, but we very often discover that after a few counts of the breath, and all of a sudden we're thinking about what's for dinner, or what happened yesterday, or what might come next, and so on. So we are distracted. But that's only normal. It's normal to be distracted. We shouldn't give up on it, because we've always been distracted. So the fact that we're noticing that we're distracted, that's already extraordinary. The nothing makes a meditation instructor more happy than if people come and say, gosh, I'm distracted all the time. The meditation instructor will say, that's really good, because now you're noticing. The worst is that you have somebody that comes and says, oh yeah, I've just spent 1 hour in samadhi, I wasn't distracted at all. Then you're like a little bit worried about where this person was, So that's where it's not about finding something, but it's more about not being lost in all the various dispersions. So that's where shamatha provides us with this quality of coming back to being grounded. So that's where the practice when we're meditating is to come back to awareness, and in this case then awareness of something, and that something that we come back to is the breath. And again, the breath is completely non-conceptual. If somebody says come back to the Dharmakaya, or come back to Dharmata, or the Dharmadhatu, or the nature of mind, we'll go, I wonder what that nature of mind is like, and I wonder what that wisdom is like, or Rigpa, or the Dharmadhatu, and wow, and is this it, And it just ends up being more and more thinking. So that's where just coming back to something that is, you could say, entirely devoid of, you say, philosophical speculation, such as the breath, is actually something that is completely honest, straightforward, and immediate. So that's where, when we're sitting and meditating, then we come back to the breath. And as we come back to the breath, then yes, there will be thoughts, there'll be perceptions, there's going to be parrots outside that are squawking, or you're going to have geckos that make funny little sounds, or you have the person next to you begins to snore, or something like that happens, where it's impossible for us to sort of go into some sort of sensory deprivation. I don't know if anybody has ever gone into I remember once visiting a friend who had a sensory deprivation tank, and you lie in salt water. Of course, this was in California, in Topanga Canyon outside of Los Angeles, you know. And of course, you might think that's the ideal, but unfortunately, you have to come out from there, and the world is still there, and your thoughts are going to be coming up anyway. So there's never going to be a time where we could actually try to extract ourselves from perceptions. But what we can do is not be distracted by them. And that's where the third aspect of meditation, the first being the posture, the second being focus on the breath. The third is then what happens with the mind. And that's where we ordinarily are distracted by the thoughts that arise. We actually train in, as thoughts arise or whatever perceptions might happen, noise from the outside or thoughts from the inside, we simply just are aware of them, but we don't necessarily get absorbed in them and carried away. And that's where coming back to the breath is not really escaping from these perceptions. It's more just that we're aware of what's happening. We might know this is an issue. We might think of something really big and looming and dramatic and heavy. We might have a big crisis on our hands in our life. We might have memories of various kinds. We might just be wondering what we're going to shop, for tomorrow and all of that. But regardless of whether we have these big or, we say thoughts that impose themselves or just ordinary domestic thoughts, regardless of whatever thoughts arise, we don't really have a judgment as we're sitting. We know that they arise, and yet we allow them to be there, being conscious of them, and yet we just come back to the breath. So in that, there's no sense of manipulating or trying to handle or negotiate whatever arises. We simply just acknowledge what is our experience, and we just come back to the breath. And that doesn't mean that we're avoiding anything, doesn't mean we're in denial of anything, but it just means that we're conscious of the thoughts, but they don't actually gain the traction that they normally get. And when the thoughts don't get the normal traction, that means that we begin to have freedom from these narratives and the grip that they normally hold on us. And that is where the object of our ordinary grasping mind, and also the one that is going through this, begins to be a little bit free of these, you could say, the tension between myself and what I'm projecting or experiencing or thinking of and so forth. That's where whatever experience arises is welcomed. There's not a preference for nice narratives, and there's not a fear of, you could say, heavy narratives. And that's where we begin to discover a little bit of independence from the grip that the ordinary thinking ordinarily has on us. It doesn't mean that we don't have thoughts, but that is where people sometimes they misunderstand the language of meditation, and they say, oh, in meditation you have no thoughts. No, it's not that you have no thoughts, but it's that you begin to have less of this, you could say, fussy censorship about what can take place in the mind and what cannot take place in the mind. There's an openness that takes place in which you're not fixating on the thoughts. And that's where people might think, oh, in meditation, you don't have any thinking. That's not the case. But the thing is that when thoughts arise, you just touch it and you let it go. You're aware of it and you let it be. And that's where meditation is radical, because ordinarily they get traction on us. We're dragged away with the thoughts right away. We're absorbed in our thoughts, our narratives. And that's where the issues and our self become very real and heavy. And that's where meditation is an enormously radical remedy, because it's where we're completely aware of what's taking place, but we're beginning to have a little bit of an autonomy where we're not necessarily controlled by it. And that is what we mean with vipassana. That's where we begin to have a perspective. Just like if, when kids are playing, you bang, bang, you're dead, and the other one says, no, I'm not, and they're really serious about their game. We as adults will look at it and we understand that they're taking this very seriously, but we also know that it's not that serious. And likewise also with the thoughts that we normally get so involved with. Like if we're in a fight with somebody, you know, then we're taking it so seriously. But we know also if you stand back, go for a ride, take a deep breath, you come back, there's a different perspective. And so likewise also, if we are connected to the practice of meditation, then also we could begin to not be so involved and not be so, you could say, entangled. And that's where we talk about Vipassana as this wider perspective. And that's where we're not running away from things, but we're seeing them with a greater, you could say, overall view. We understand more the complexity and the elements of the situation. And also with that comes more compassion. It's not about me and my issue or me struggling against that person that we're fighting with. It's more understanding the two of us and the situation. So that's where this Vipassana comes with a whole flavor of compassion. That's why the sage has love, why the sage has compassion, is because there's not the same entanglement, there's not the same politics involved. So that's the sort of general. See, I had no idea what I was going to say. And then this came up, and I still actually would yet to talk a little bit about just when we begin the meditation session. I'd like to do this in conjunction with a practice called Buddha Anusmriti, and that is invoking the Buddha. And that is essentially bringing in the inspiration of the Buddha, because normally we sit with ourselves and our issues and our meditation, but actually having this sense of something greater there creates an atmosphere of something really sacred and charged with this quality of sanity. And that's why in the general Buddhist traditions, we practice Anusmriti. Vajrayana people, they invoke their guru or they think of their guru. All of this is something that actually invokes a particular atmosphere, particular inspiration. And we never ever think that the Buddha ultimately is external from ourselves, like a savior. We never think that the deity is out there. Buddhism is, as we know, non-theistic. So there's never the notion that there's something else that's going to do it for us. But we do have the notion that there is what we call the Nirmanakaya, or you could say the compassionate presence of teachers that are there to show us. And so that's where invoking the Buddha is invoking you could say the compassionate manifestation of the Buddha as an object which shows us beyond what is objective. So that's where you could say all the various methodologies that we have in Buddhism and all the presence of the teachers and so on, all have the single, you could say, purpose to show us that which is beyond the objective, that which is innately, you could say, innate to us in terms of just being free from any reference point. But we do use reference points to get to that. And that's where, for example, even non-Buddhists, they'll go and have, go to a teaching with the Dalai Lama, and they'll be hugely impressed. Even they're not Buddhist. I was just at my dentist. My dentist went to see the Dalai Lama. He was deeply impressed with the Dalai Lama. And he's not particularly Buddhist, but ordinary people just get it. And of course, us who have some appreciation for, you could say, the nature of the enlightenment and so on, we appreciate this. So when we do the practice of meditation here, I usually combine this with the practice of recollecting the Buddha. So I'm going to be reading through the text, but I have a few copies here. Do you want to? I don't know if some of you can share, but I'll print some more next time. I only have a few copies this time. And this is something I'd always recommend, really, and particularly in the actually in the Dzogchen tradition. This is very much how in the Dzogchen tradition you would actually practice. You would always have something, and also other Buddhist traditions. You have something first, something that has, you could say, a conceptual reference point, and then you let go of that conceptual reference point. So in this case, we have the Buddha as the conceptual reference point because it takes us beyond takes us beyond reference. So I'm just gonna let's see here. Yeah, where is it? It's up there. I think the device is up there somewhere. Yeah, it is a bit. Feel free to crank it up.
What was it at now? Oh yeah.
Yeah. Sounds good.
For everyone, maybe. Shouldn't be uncomfortable.
Is this a new idea? Nothing?
Slightly new. Okay. So I'll just read a few lines here from the text, and then we'll begin with what's called taking refuge. It says, in the Samadhi-Raj Sutra, it said, those who while walking, sitting, standing, or sleeping recollect the moonlight Buddha will always be in the Buddha's presence and will attain the vast nirvana. And his pure body is the color of gold, beautiful is the protector of the world. Whoever visualizes him like this practices the meditation of the Bodhisattvas. In keeping with this, we should practice remembering our incomparable teacher, the Lord of Sages, in the following way. So this, by the way, is written by a great sage called Mipam Rinpoche, who actually had a vision of the Buddha. It's on the basis of this that he wrote this. So it's a very devotional liturgy. So I hope you're comfortable with bhakti and devotion. And if there ever was a reason for, you could say, expressing poetic appreciation, just like we have it in love poetry, then certainly appreciation of the Buddha is very much, you could say, justifiable. So we begin first with what's called taking refuge, and then there's some expression of what we call the four immeasurables, and then there's the visualization, and then there's a devotional chant to the Buddha and some short mantras, and then on the basis of that, then we dissolve the visualization and then settle in to do some meditation. So we're running a little bit over time today, but I hope that's okay. So when we're taking refuge, actually, we would normally think of the Buddha in front. So you could think that you're in Bodh Gaya and Buddha's there in front of you. In the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly, I take refuge until I attain enlightenment. Through the merit of practicing generosity and so on, may I attain Buddhahood for the benefit of all beings. In the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly, I take refuge until I attain enlightenment. Through the merit of practicing generosity and so on, may I attain Buddhahood for the benefit of all beings. In the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly, I take refuge until I attain enlightenment. Through the merit of practicing generosity and so on, may I attain Buddhahood for the benefit of all beings. May all sentient beings enjoy happiness in the causes of happiness. May they be free from suffering in the causes of suffering. May they never be separated from the sacred happiness devoid of suffering. And may they dwell in boundless equanimity that is free from attachment and aversion. As the union of unborn emptiness and the ceaseless appearances of interdependence, magically there appears before me in the sky, amidst vast clouds of offerings, on a jewel-lined throne and lotus sun and moon disk seats, the incomparable teacher lion of the Shakyas. His body the color of gold, adorned with major and minor marks, clad in the three Dharma robes, he sits in Vajra posture. His right hand gracefully poised in the earth-touching mudra, and his left hand in the gesture of meditation holding an alms bowl full of nectar. Like a mountain of gold, magnificent he shines in splendor, spreading beams of wisdom light across the whole expanse of space. The 8 closed suns, 16 elders, and the like, a vast ocean-like retinue of noble beings encircles him all around. Simply think of him and he grants the glory of the highest bliss, liberation from samsara and nirvana, the two extremes. He is the great being, perfect embodiment of every source of refuge. With your great compassion, you embraced this turbulent and degenerate world and made 500 mighty aspirations. You are as exalted as the white lotus. Whoever hears your name shall never return to samsara. Most compassionate teacher, to you I pay homage. All my own and others' virtues of body, speech, and mind, together with all our possessions, visualized like Samantabhadra's offering clouds, I offer to you. All the harmful actions and transgressions I have committed throughout beginningless time, each and every one I now confess with intense and heartfelt regret. In all virtuous actions of noble ones and ordinary beings, accumulated throughout the past, present, and future, I rejoice. Turn the wheel of the profound and vast Dharma teachings ceaselessly in every direction, I pray. Your wisdom body is like space and remains changeless throughout the past, present, and future. Yet in the perception of those to be guided, you go through the display of birth and death. Even so, let your form body continue always to appear. Through all the virtues I have accumulated in the past, am accumulating now, and will accumulate in the future, for the sake of benefiting all beings who are as infinite as space, may you, the sovereign of Dharma, be forever pleased, and may all attain the state of the victorious one, the Lord of Dharma. Living beings like us, adrift in this degenerate age, have no guidance nor protection. Because of your kindness, caring for us with surpassing compassion, every manifestation in this world now of the three jewels is your enlightened activity. You are then our only refuge, incomparable, supreme. So from our hearts we pray with total confidence and faith. Do not neglect the great promises you made in times gone by, but hold us until we attain. Supreme Teacher Bhagavan Tathagata Arhat, complete and perfect Buddha, glorious conqueror, Shakyamuni Buddha, to you I pay homage, to you make offerings, in you I take refuge. Supreme Teacher Bhagavan Tathagata Arhat, complete and perfect Buddha, glorious conqueror, Shakyamuni Buddha, to you I pay homage, to you I make offerings, in you I take refuge. Supreme Teacher Bhagavan Tathagata Arhat, complete and perfect Buddha, glorious conqueror, Shakyamuni Buddha, to you I pay homage, to you I make offerings, in you I take refuge. Te yata o muni muni mahamunaya soha. 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 Jayata 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 muni muni mahamunaya soha. Om muni muni mahamunaya soha. Om Muni Muni Mahamunaya Soha. Om Muni Muni Mahamunaya Soha. So at this point, we'll just recite 100 of this short Dharani, Om Muni Muni Mahamunaya Soha. It is actually in the handout, but I'm realizing I might have handed out an old edition. So I apologize about that. I'll make sure to have the right one next time. But anyway, the mantra is in there. Om Muni Muni Mahamunaya Soha. So we'll just chant that 100 times. Om Muni Muni Mahamunaya Soha. Om Mani Mani Mahamani Soha. From the Buddha's body there emanates a great radiance, a multicolored rays of wisdom light, dispelling all our own and others' obscurations and causing all the genuine qualities of the Mahayana path to rise within us so that we attain the level of perfection from which we will never return again to samsara. So at this point then, with this visualization just of the Buddha's presence, then dissolving into light, then simply just settling into meditation like I was talking about before in terms of just grounding the body, in terms of the structure, our posture, in terms of just the focus on the, you can say, non-distracted quality of the mind, just coming back to the breath. And in terms of whatever arises in the mind, simply not being distracted. And even when we are distracted, then simply just coming back to non-distraction. We settle in this condition of in which there's a natural quality of peace in the mind, and whatever arises, we allow to just arise without necessarily it distracting us. And in this way, sort of breaking free from the ordinary, you could say, absorption in our thinking, then this provides a greater perspective, which is vipassana. So we'll sit like that for, let's say, 15 minutes. So we'll conclude with the dedication. I don't know, in the back of this edition that you have there, there might be, do you have the aspiration prayer of Maitreya? It's there? Okay, at least I got that right. So you're welcome to join in. We have a fierce chanter in Jack in the back there, but you give him some competition.
Where are you going, just the back page?
No, the where it says the aspiration prayer of Maitreya, a few pages earlier. You might have to go silent. No? I think you should do that. Yeah. Okay. I prostrate to all the Buddhas and to the Bodhisattvas endowed with the divine eye of the sages, and to the Shravakas as well. I prostrate to Bodhicitta, which counteracts birth in all lower realms, perfectly shows the path to the higher realms, and leads to no aging nor death. Whatever negative actions I have done under the influence of an afflicted mind, in the presence of the Buddhas, I fully acknowledge them all. By the accumulation of any merit I have created through the three kinds of activities, may my seed of omniscience grow, and may I attain awakening that never ends. Whatever offerings to the Buddhas that can be found in realms of the 10 directions are known to the Buddhas who rejoice in them. I rejoice in all these offerings. I fully acknowledge all negative actions and rejoice in all merit. I prostrate to all the Buddhas, may I attain supreme primordial wisdom. I earnestly request the Bodhisattvas who reside on the 10 levels in all the direction of the worlds and the 10 directions to awaken into supreme enlightenment. Once you have awakened into genuine enlightenment and tamed the Maras and their hordes, may you turn the wheel of Dharma so that all living beings may be healed. With the sound of the great Dharma drum, may you free all sentient beings who are suffering. Throughout inconceivable millions of kalpas, may you remain and teach the Dharma. Mired in the swamp of desire, entangled in the strands of cyclic existence, I am fettered by all that binds. I supplicate those supreme among humans to look upon me. The Buddhas do not blame sentient beings who are flawed. With a loving heart for all sentient beings, may the Buddhas free them from the ocean of cyclic existence. Any perfect Buddhas who are present, those who have passed away, and those yet to come, may I train following in their way and engage in enlightened conduct. Having perfected the 6 paramitas, may I liberate the 6 families of sentient beings. Having actualized the 6 extraordinary faculties, may I reach unexcelled enlightenment. Future phenomena are not born, and those past will not occur. Present phenomena have no inherent nature. There is no actual location. There is no perception. There are no outer things. May I realize the Dhammadhatu of emptiness. According to the Buddhas, the great sages, there are no truly existent sentient beings, no life force. There is no truly existent individual and no nurturing of a self. May I realize the Dhammatā where the self is not present. An entity such as grasping onto a self and mind is not present within any of the paramitas. To benefit all sentient beings, may I give with generosity, free of avarice. Since things do not exist as entities, may my wealth appear spontaneously. Since all things totally disintegrate, may I perfect the paramita of generosity. Endowed with a flawless ethics that is guided by rules and an ethics that is completely pure, with an ethics free of an arrogant mind, may I perfect the paramita of ethics. Just as the elements of earth, water, fire, and wind, bodhisattvas do not remain caught by mental constructs. By attaining patience, anger never arises. May I perfect the paramita of patience. Through the power of previous perseverance, having become stable, enthusiastic, and free of laziness, and through a strong body and mind, may I perfect the paramita of purpose. Through the samadhi where all is illusion-like, through the samadhi of the hero's stride, and through the samadhi that is like a vajra, may I perfect the paramita of meditative concentration. Through actualizing the 3 gates of full liberation, the equal nature of the 3 times, and the 3 types of knowing as well, may I perfect the paramita of prajna. Through persevering in the bodhisattva's practice, may I attain the kaya praised by all the Buddhas, the luminous kaya and the kaya blazing with majesty. Thus may my intention be fulfilled. May I be like the famed Maitreya who engaged in such a practice, perfected the paramitas, and perfectly abides at the zenith of the 10th level. By this merit, may all attain omniscience, may it defeat the enemy wrongdoing. From the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death, from the ocean of samsara, may all beings be free. May bodhicitta, precious and sublime, arise where it has not yet come to be, and where it has arisen, may it never fail, but go and flourish ever more and more. May the Buddha appear in this world. May the light of the teachings shine like the sun. May the holders of the teachings live in harmony, and thus may all be auspicious for the teaching to endure. We pray for the good health of the teachers. We pray for their precious lives to be long. We pray for their activities to spread and increase. May we be blessed never to part from the teachers. Akashasya stiti yavat yavaccha jagataha stiti tavam mama stiti bhuya jagadukani ignata. Akashasya stiti yavat yavaccha jagataha stiti tavam mama stiti bhuya jagadukani ignata. Tavam mama stiti bhuya jagadukani ignata. Tavam mama stiti bhuya jagadukani ignata. As long as space remains, as long as the world remains, may I too remain to alleviate the sufferings of the world. Okay, that's it. Thank you very much. So, so the programs will resume. I think for the time being, we're doing it out here, but we might be doing it back in Mullen. We'll see. Depends a little bit on the sort of restrictions and how they apply right now. But yeah, we should be going on for the rest of the year. So welcome back, and hope to see you again. Thank you.
Yeah, that's great. That's good. Right.